Every secret tells a story.
The evening shadows lengthened across the ancient churchyard of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar cobblestone path, her walking stick tapping gently against stones worn smooth by centuries of faithful footsteps. Easter Eve had always held a special significance in the village, when the very air seemed to shimmer with anticipation and the promise of renewal that would come with tomorrow's dawn. The daffodils nodded cheerfully in the gentle spring breeze, their golden faces catching the last rays of sunlight, while the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to evening service drifted across the village green. She paused at the lych gate, adjusting her worn leather gloves and observing the steady stream of villagers making their way toward St. John the Baptist Church with that keen interest that had served her so well over her many years. The ancient Norman structure stood majestically against the darkening sky, its tower reaching toward heaven with the confidence of 800 years of continuous worship. Tonight, warm light spilled from the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the churchyard, and Miss Marple could hear the faint sound of the organ being tested for the evening's special service. Mrs. Bantry swept past in her usual theatrical manner, her voice carrying across the churchyard as she directed her husband, Colonel Bantry, toward their customary pew, while Dr. Haydock nodded pleasantly to Miss Marple before disappearing through the heavy oak doors. Young Timothy Fletcher, the earnest choir master, hurried by with an armful of hymn books, his perpetually worried expression suggesting that he feared some musical catastrophe might befall the evening's proceedings. But it was Father Benedict who caught Miss Marple's particular attention as he emerged from the vestry door, his usually serene countenance marked by deep lines of concern that seemed oddly out of place on this holiest of evenings. The young priest had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months ago to assist the aging Reverend Clement, and had quickly endeared himself to the congregation with his thoughtful sermons and genuine warmth. Tonight, however, something was clearly troubling him deeply. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite her 70-odd years, noted the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his clerical collar and the way his gaze seemed to dart nervously toward the village beyond the churchyard. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned to recognize the signs of a person wrestling with a significant moral dilemma, and Father Benedict was displaying every one of them. As she finally made her way through the gate and into the church, Miss Marple was struck by the atmosphere of hushed reverence that filled the ancient nave. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and old wood, mingling with the lingering fragrance of Easter lilies that decorated the altar. The congregation had settled into their familiar pews, faces illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight as Father Benedict began the evening service with a voice that carried renewed strength despite his earlier troubled demeanor. Miss Marple took her usual seat toward the back, from where she could observe the assembled villagers with her characteristic discretion. There was Mrs. Elmsworth in her customary front pew, her expensive fur coat a stark contrast to the simple woolens and tweeds of her neighbors, her expression one of almost defiant piety as she followed the service with rigid attention. The wealthy widow had always been a formidable presence in village affairs, her considerable opinions making her both respected and, if truth be told, occasionally resented by her fellow parishioners. The service unfolded with its traditional grace, hymns rising and falling through the nave, while Father Benedict's homily spoke eloquently of renewal, sacrifice, and the profound peace that followed even the deepest darkness. Miss Marple listened with half her attention, while the other half catalogued the small details that others might miss. Mrs. Price Ridley's nervous glances toward the vestry, young Master Thompson's restless fidgeting, and the way Mrs. Elmsworth's jaw seemed to tighten whenever Father Benedict spoke of forgiveness and the importance of confessing one's sins. As the final blessing was given and the congregation began to stir, preparing to depart into the cool night air, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Elmsworth remained unusually still in her front pew. The elderly woman often lingered after services, particularly when she wished to discuss some matter of church business with Father Benedict. But tonight, something seemed different about her posture. What had initially appeared to be serene contemplation now struck Miss Marple as oddly rigid, almost brittle. The young acolyte, who had been extinguishing candles near the altar, approached Mrs. Elmsworth's pew, presumably to inform her that the church would soon be locked for the night. His sudden, sharp gasp pierced the quietude like a blade, his small face pale with terror as he pointed with trembling finger at the dark stain spreading across the rich fur of her coat. "She's not breathing," he whispered, his voice barely audible but laden with horror. Father Benedict rushed forward from the sacristy, his face shifting from concern to disbelief and then to profound shock as he took in the scene before him. Mrs. Elmsworth sat slumped in her pew, her eyes wide and staring, fixed on some unseen point in the vastness of the ancient church. A delicate ivory letter opener, its handle carved with intricate religious motifs, lay on the pew beside her gloved hand, its tip darkly stained. Miss Marple recognized the implement immediately, having seen it many times on Mrs. Elmsworth's writing desk during various committee meetings. The horror was undeniable. The formidable Mrs. Elmsworth had been murdered, struck down, in the very heart of the village on the most sacred of nights. The peace of St. Mary Mead was irrevocably shattered, and Miss Marple's keen mind was already beginning to sift through the fragments of the evening, connecting the subtle threads of human behavior she had so meticulously observed. The news of Mrs. Elmsworth's murder spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable speed that only genuine scandal could achieve. By dawn on Easter morning, when the church bells should have been pealing in joyous celebration, they remained ominously silent while police tape cordoned off the ancient building. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham before breakfast, his sharp features and brusque manner immediately establishing him as a man who preferred facts to feelings and swift conclusions to prolonged mysteries. He surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency, barking orders to Constable Hemmings, whose usual duties involved little more than mediating disputes over garden boundaries and the occasional bicycle theft. Dr. Haydock, summoned back to examine the body more thoroughly in daylight, confirmed his preliminary assessment. The wound had been made by Mrs. Elmsworth's own ivory letter opener, thrust with considerable force between her ribs and into her heart. The weapon bore her initials and the delicate religious carvings she had often displayed proudly during committee meetings. What struck the doctor as particularly significant was the precision of the attack, suggesting either medical knowledge or extraordinary luck on the killer's part. The village reacted with that peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that violent death invariably provokes in small communities. Mrs. Bantry, arriving at Miss Marple's cottage before the morning tea had properly steeped, brought with her the first wave of theories and speculation that would soon engulf St. Mary Mead like floodwater. Over hastily poured cups and barely buttered toast, the two women discussed the shocking developments while Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm, clicking softly as she worked on a pale yellow blanket for the vicar's newest grandchild. Inspector Slack's initial investigation revealed that the church had been locked from within during the service, eliminating the possibility of an outside intruder. This uncomfortable fact forced attention onto the congregation itself, transforming familiar neighbors into potential suspects. The inspector's methodical questioning soon focused on young Timothy Fletcher, the earnest choir master who had been seen near Mrs. Elmsworth's pew during the service. Several witnesses recalled a heated exchange between Timothy and the deceased following Thursday's choir practice, something about Easter hymn selections that had escalated beyond mere musical disagreement. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to withhold potentially damaging information, informed Inspector Slack that she had overheard Mrs. Elmsworth telling Timothy that young people had no respect for tradition and that his modern musical preferences were entirely inappropriate for such a sacred occasion. Timothy had apparently left the practice session quite upset, muttering something about stubborn old women who couldn't appreciate artistic vision. While hardly constituting a motive for murder, it established Timothy as someone who harbored resentment against the victim. More troubling still was Father Benedict's increasingly obvious distress. The young priest, normally composed even under pressure, appeared genuinely shaken by something beyond the natural horror of finding a parishioner murdered in his church. Mrs. Dane reported seeing Father Benedict and Mrs. Elmsworth engaged in what appeared to be an intense private conversation in the vestry before the service began. Both had emerged looking troubled, though they had quickly composed themselves for the evening's proceedings. Other theories proliferated with remarkable speed. The recent dispute over Mrs. Elmsworth's attempt to purchase Henderson's field for church expansion had created considerable ill will, though old Henderson's advanced age and crippling arthritis made him an unlikely assassin. More promising was the persistent rumor that Mrs. Elmsworth had been planning to revise her will, potentially disinheriting her London niece in favor of the church roof fund. Financial motives, as Inspector Slack well knew, had inspired countless murders throughout history. Miss Weatherby contributed the information that Mrs. Elmsworth's companion, Miss Ada Pierce, had seemed unusually agitated recently, apparently over some matter involving wages and what she perceived as insufficient respect for her long years of faithful service. Miss Pierce's severe demeanor and sensible shoes had always made her seem capable of decisive action, though whether such action might extend to murder remained an open question. Miss Marple listened to these various theories with her characteristic patience, neither endorsing nor dismissing any particular possibility. Her pale blue eyes, however, noted several details that others seemed to overlook. Mrs. Elmsworth's behavior during the service had been markedly different from her usual pattern, her rigid posture suggesting internal tension rather than peaceful devotion. The positioning of the letter openers, too, struck her as somehow theatrical, placed with a precision that seemed almost deliberate. As Inspector Slack continued his investigation, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence with methodical thoroughness, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the obvious explanations would prove inadequate. The murder of Mrs. Elmsworth was clearly rooted in the complex web of relationships, secrets, and long-standing grievances that lay beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface. The truth, she suspected, would require a deeper understanding of human nature than Inspector Slack's straightforward approach was likely to provide. Someone in their peaceful village harbored a darkness sufficient to commit murder in God's house, and that someone was undoubtedly counting on the very ordinariness of village life to provide. The morning light filtering through the ancient stained-glass windows of St. John the Baptist revealed a scene that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Inspector Slack had established his command post in the vestry, transforming the sacred space into something resembling a courtroom with its methodical questioning and careful documentation. Miss Marple, who never intruded where uninvited, nevertheless found herself drawn to observe the unfolding investigation from the churchyard, her keen eyes noting the subtle drama playing out among the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock emerged from his second examination of the crime scene with information that cast the murder in an entirely new light. Speaking quietly to Miss Marple near the war memorial, he revealed that the wound had been delivered with remarkable precision, striking exactly where it would cause immediate death while leaving minimal external bleeding. More significantly, the angle of the wound suggested that the killer had been seated beside Mrs. Elmsworth rather than standing behind her, transforming what might have appeared to be a sudden attack into something far more calculated and intimate. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of the evening's events. Someone had sat beside the formidable Mrs. Elmsworth during the service, close enough to engage in whispered conversation, close enough to strike without attracting attention from other parishioners lost in prayer and hymn. The killer had possessed not only opportunity and means, but also the extraordinary composure necessary to commit murder while surrounded by witnesses in the most sacred of settings. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, continued his methodical interrogation of witnesses, his attention increasingly focused on young Timothy Fletcher, The choir master's obvious distress, combined with his admitted resentment toward Mrs. Elmsworth over musical selections, made him an appealingly straightforward suspect. Timothy's stammering protests of innocence and his visible agitation only seemed to reinforce the inspector's growing conviction that the case might be resolved more quickly than initially anticipated. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of this convenient solution. Her afternoon walk past the church allowed her to observe Father Benedict's continued strange behavior, noting how the young priest avoided looking at the building entirely, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the village green. When approached by parishioners seeking comfort or guidance, he listened with distracted politeness before excusing himself with obvious relief. The dark circles beneath his eyes and his slightly askew clerical collar suggested a sleepless night filled with something more complex than simple shock at finding a parishioner murdered in his church. The arrival of Claudia Elmsworth from London brought a new dimension to the investigation. The deceased's niece, fashionably dressed and clearly uncomfortable with village life, expressed her grief in brief, efficient bursts while displaying obvious annoyance at the disruption to her schedule. When questioned about the rumored changes to her aunt's will, she maintained that any alterations would still have left her financially secure. Miss Marple noted the faint smudge of violet ink on the young woman's right glove and, more tellingly, the quick dart of her eyes whenever Father Benedict appeared within view. Miss Ada Pierce, Mrs. Elmsworth's long-suffering companion, presented another intriguing aspect to the unfolding mystery. Her interview with Inspector Slack had been conducted with stoic composure, almost coldness, as she recounted her employer's habits and recent activities. She confirmed the rumors about the will changes and admitted to standing to inherit only a modest annuity after decades of devoted service. Her resentment, though carefully controlled, was unmistakable to those who knew how to read the subtle signs of long-suppressed emotion. Mrs. Bantry's hastily organized tea gathering provided Miss Marple with additional fragments of information that gradually assembled into a more complete picture. Mrs. Price Ridley reported overhearing an urgent whispered conversation between Mrs. Elmsworth and an unidentified person in the churchyard before the service, their exchange conducted with obvious intensity before being interrupted by arriving parishioners. Miss Weatherby contributed the observation that Miss Pierce had seemed unusually animated following the service, lingering near the front pew with focused attention on some detail that escaped others' notice. Most intriguing to Miss Marple was the theatrical quality of the crime scene itself. The ivory letter opener, carved with religious motifs and bearing Mrs. Elmsworth's initials, lay beside the body with almost deliberate precision. The weapon's placement seemed calculated to direct attention, as if the killer wanted to ensure that this particular detail would not be overlooked. During her brief, permitted observation of the nave, Miss Marple noted a small tuft of blue wool caught on the carved end of the front pew and what appeared to be candle grease on the communion rail, details that seemed insignificant to others, but struck her as potentially meaningful. The choice of Easter Eve for the murder also suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. The killer had selected a moment when the entire community would be gathered in sacred contemplation, their attention focused on spiritual rather than temporal matters. This timing, combined with the symbolic use of Mrs. Elmsworth's own letter opener, indicated someone who understood both the psychological impact of their actions and the practical advantages of hiding in plain sight. As evening approached and the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple found herself convinced that the truth lay not in obvious tensions and public disagreements, but in quieter secrets that shaped daily life in their seemingly peaceful community. Inspector Slack's focus on Timothy Fletcher, while understandable, represented a dangerous oversimplification. The real killer remained hidden among familiar faces, protected by the very ordinariness that made their crime seem so shocking, watching the investigation unfold while carefully guiding suspicion toward more convenient targets. Effect camouflage for their terrible deed. Inspector Slack's confidence reached its zenith by Tuesday morning as he prepared for what he clearly intended to be Timothy Fletcher's final interrogation. The young choir master arrived at the makeshift police station in the village hall with trembling hands and a complexion that had grown increasingly ashen since Mrs. Elmsworth's discovery. His nervous demeanor, combined with mounting evidence and his admitted public disagreement with the victim, had convinced the inspector that the case was essentially solved, requiring only a confession to complete his methodical work. The evidence against Timothy appeared compelling on its surface, building into what Inspector Slack considered an unassailable case. Several witnesses had confirmed the heated exchange following Thursday's choir practice, when Mrs. Elmsworth dismissed his Easter musical selections as inappropriately modern for such sacred occasions. Mrs. Price Ridley testified that she had heard Timothy mutter about stubborn old women who couldn't appreciate artistic vision, while Miss Weatherby reported seeing him near the front pew during the service, ostensibly arranging hymn books, but certainly close enough to commit the crime. More damaging still was the discovery of what appeared to be blood on Timothy's choir robe, found hanging in the vestry after the service. The blue wool fibers snagged on the carved end of Mrs. Elmsworth's pew matched the choir scarves perfectly, and Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggested the stains were indeed human blood, though he cautioned that more thorough testing would be required for definitive confirmation. Timothy's explanation that he had suffered a nosebleed during practice seemed suspiciously convenient, particularly when his obvious agitation prevented him from providing a clear account of his movements during the crucial moments. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the inspector's hasty conclusions, her pale blue eyes noting details that others dismissed as coincidental. During her afternoon visit to Mrs. Bantry, she shared her growing conviction that the obvious solution was precisely what someone wanted them to believe. The placement of evidence seemed almost theatrical, designed to direct suspicion toward the most convenient target rather than revealing genuine guilt. Timothy Fletcher, despite his artistic temperament and public disagreements with the victim, struck her as fundamentally incapable of the calculated coldness required for such a precisely executed crime. Her doubts were reinforced by careful observation of other potential suspects whose behavior suggested depths of complexity that Inspector Slack had barely begun to explore. Father Benedict's continued distress seemed to stem from something more profound than simple shock. His obvious avoidance of certain topics during casual conversation, combined with his inability to meet questioners' eyes directly. The young priest's sermons had become disjointed, his gaze frequently darting to the empty pew where Mrs. Elmsworth had met her end, as though he carried a burden that pressed heavily upon his conscience. The arrival of additional information from London added new complexity to the investigation that Inspector Slack seemed reluctant to pursue. Claudia Elmsworth's financial situation proved more precarious than initially apparent, with substantial gambling debts that would have made her aunt's inheritance crucial rather than merely convenient. More significantly, inquiries revealed that she had visited St. Mary Mead twice in recent weeks, despite her claims of minimal contact with her aunt. Miss Marple noted the persistent violet ink stain on the young woman's glove, which seemed to connect to a similar mark she had observed in Mrs. Elmsworth's prayer book. Miss Ada Pierce presented another puzzle that defied easy explanation, her stoic composure during questioning impressing Inspector Slack as appropriate grief while troubling Miss Marple's more experienced eye. The companions claimed to have remained in the back pew throughout the service contradicted Mrs. Dane's distinct memory of seeing her near the front during the final hymn. When questioned about this discrepancy, Miss Pierce had dismissed it as confusion arising from shock, but her explanation lacked the conviction of genuine memory. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination yielded additional puzzling details that seemed to contradict Inspector Slack's straightforward narrative. The angle and depth of the wound suggested considerable knowledge of human anatomy, striking with precision that indicated either medical training or extraordinary luck. Most intriguingly, he discovered traces of an expensive, distinctive perfume on the victim's clothing, certainly not something Mrs. Elmsworth would have worn given her preference for simple lavender water. This detail suggested intimate contact between victim and killer, a closeness inconsistent with Timothy's relationship with the deceased. Miss Marple's own permitted examination of the church revealed additional anomalies that troubled her methodical mind. The communion wine showed fingerprints that didn't match Father Benedict or the altar servers, while a prayer book in Mrs. Elmsworth's customary pew contained fresh pencil marks that appeared recent. Most puzzling was the discovery of a small gold button beneath the front pew, its expensive design suggesting clothing far more costly than typically worn by St. Mary Mead residents. The theatrical quality of the crime scene continued to disturb Miss Marple's sense of proportion. The ivory letter opener, carved with religious motifs and bearing Mrs. Elmsworth's initials, lay beside the body with almost deliberate precision, as though the killer wanted to ensure this particular detail would not be overlooked. The choice of Easter Eve for the murder suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. Someone who understood both the psychological impact and the practical advantages of hiding in plain sight among the faithful. As Inspector Slack prepared to formally charge Timothy Fletcher with murder, Miss Marple found herself convinced that the real killer remained hidden among familiar faces, protected by the very ordinariness that made their crime seem so shocking. The truth lay not in obvious motives and public disagreements, but in quieter secrets that shaped the hidden currents of daily life, secrets that someone was prepared to kill, to protect, while carefully orchestrating events to ensure blame would fall elsewhere. Miss Marple's Wednesday morning visit to the church, ostensibly to arrange fresh daffodils for the Easter altar, proved far more illuminating than Inspector Slack's methodical but unimaginative investigation. While the inspector prepared for what he confidently expected to be Timothy Fletcher's final interrogation, Miss Marple's keen eyes discovered what his thorough search had entirely missed. Wedged between two ancient prayer books in the rack behind Mrs. Elmsworth's customary pew lay a small piece of cream-colored paper, folded with precise care and bearing elegant handwriting in distinctive violet ink. The fragment contained only a few words, but their significance struck Miss Marple with startling clarity. Written in a refined feminine hand were the words, "Confessional tonight after service," followed by what appeared to be the beginning of a signature before the paper had been deliberately torn. The violet ink matched perfectly the stains she had observed on Claudia Elmsworth's glove during their brief encounter, creating a connection that transformed the entire investigation's focus from obvious suspects to hidden relationships. Her discovery gained additional weight when young Tom Redding, the earnest acolyte, approached her near the altar with his characteristic gravity. The boy had been troubled by something he witnessed after the service ended, when most parishioners had departed into the cool night air. A lady with a soft London accent and expensive perfume had lingered near the sanctuary, he confided with the ruthless honesty of children. She had told him to run along after he noticed her steadying the communion wine bottle, which had wobbled when she touched the silver cruet tray. The boy's precise mimicry of the cultured voice left Miss Marple with little doubt about the mysterious visitor's identity. This revelation led Miss Marple to examine Mrs. Elmsworth's prayer book with renewed attention, an item that Inspector Slack had dismissed after noting what he termed irrelevant pencil marks. Her careful inspection revealed not pencil marks at all, but faint indentations pressed into the paper with considerable force. The pattern was intricate and unmistakably metallic, creating tiny depressions that formed an ornate, floral design. When she retrieved the small gold button that Constable Hemmings had found beneath the front pew, the connection became undeniable. Holding the expensive button against the prayer book's marked page, Miss Marple observed a perfect alignment between the button's decorative scrollwork and the paper's indentations. Someone had sat beside Mrs. Elmsworth during the service, nervously pressing this button into the prayer book while engaging in whispered conversation. The button's obvious quality and fashionable design eliminated Timothy Fletcher and most other village suspects, pointing instead towards someone accustomed to expensive London attire. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination, when discreetly consulted, supported Miss Marple's emerging theory about the crime's intimate nature. The positioning and angle of the fatal wound, he confirmed, was entirely consistent with an attack delivered by someone seated directly beside the victim rather than standing behind her. More significantly, traces of expensive perfume on Mrs. Elmsworth's clothing suggested close physical contact during her final moments, while the discovery of a small, empty vial beneath the vestry cabinet revealed evidence of careful premeditation. The vial, though thoroughly cleaned, bore microscopic traces of what Dr. Haydock identified as a mild sedative. Someone had planned not merely to kill Mrs. Elmsworth, but to ensure she would be disoriented and unable to defend herself effectively. This chilling detail transformed what had appeared to be a crime of passion into something far more calculated and cold-blooded, requiring both medical knowledge and access to pharmaceutical supplies. Father Benedict's continued distress took on new significance in light of these discoveries. His obvious avoidance of direct questions and his inability to meet questioners' eyes suggested the burden of terrible knowledge. When Miss Marple encountered him near the war memorial, his admission that recent confessions had troubled him deeply, though he could not violate the sacred seal, indicated that someone had shared information weighing heavily upon his conscience. The young priest's behavior suggested he possessed crucial knowledge about the evening's events, but felt bound by religious duty to remain silent. Miss Ada Pierce's testimony, initially impressive to Inspector Slack for its composed precision, now appeared suspiciously rehearsed when viewed through Miss Marple's more experienced lens. The companion's claim to have remained in the back pew throughout the service contradicted multiple witness accounts, while her detailed knowledge of Mrs. Elmsworth's financial affairs and recent correspondence suggested access to information that extended well beyond her official duties. Her stoic demeanor during questioning, rather than indicating appropriate grief, now seemed almost theatrical in its calculated perfection. The theatrical quality of the entire crime scene, which had troubled Miss Marple from the beginning, now revealed its true purpose as deliberate misdirection. The ivory letter opener, placed with such obvious precision beside the body, had been intended to focus attention on Mrs. Elmsworth's personal effects while drawing investigation away from more significant evidence. The killer had counted on Inspector Slack's straightforward approach, knowing that obvious clues would be seized upon while subtler indicators remained overlooked. Mrs. Dane's belated recollection of witnessing an urgent conversation between Mrs. Elmsworth and an unidentified person near the church gate before the service provided additional confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions. The exchange had appeared confrontational, almost desperate, before being interrupted by arriving parishioners. The second party's expensive perfume and cultured accent eliminated several potential suspects, while pointing toward others whose presence in St. Mary Mead that evening had not been adequately explained or investigated. As Inspector Slack prepared to formally charge Timothy Fletcher with murder, Miss Marple found herself in possession of evidence that painted an entirely different picture of the evening's tragic events. The real killer remained hidden among familiar faces, protected by assumptions about respectability and social position, but their carefully constructed facade was beginning to reveal cracks that only the most observant eye would detect. Inspector Slack received Miss Marple's evidence with the grudging attention of a man whose carefully constructed case had developed inconvenient complications. The cream-colored paper fragment bearing violet ink, the expensive gold button with its telltale indentations in Mrs. Elmsworth's prayer book, and young Tom Redding's earnest testimony about a perfumed London lady near the communion wine forced him to acknowledge that perhaps Timothy Fletcher's guilt was not as certain as he had believed. With visible reluctance, he telephoned Much Benham to postpone the formal charges, though his tone suggested that such delays were personally offensive to his sense of proper procedure. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the Blue Boar revealed Claudia Elmsworth in a carefully maintained pose of fashionable grief, dressed in dove-grey silk with that expensive perfume that lingered like an accusation. When Miss Marple mentioned the note about a confessional meeting, Claudia's composure flickered momentarily before she explained that her aunt had requested this private conversation to discuss recent will changes. Her fingers betrayed her, however, straying unconsciously to the missing button on her jacket cuff, and when Miss Marple's keen eyes followed the gesture, Claudia laughed with forced lightness about losing it in the crush of departing parishioners. More tellingly, when Miss Marple spoke generally about sedatives and the vestry cabinet, Claudia's quick question about the cruet tray revealed knowledge she should not have possessed. The discovery of Mrs. Elmsworth's private correspondence with her London solicitor transformed the investigation entirely, revealing not simple inheritance disputes, but systematic embezzlement extending back several years. Claudia had been forging her aunt's signature on various financial documents, gradually transferring substantial funds into accounts under her control. Mrs. Elmsworth's recent discovery of these transactions had prompted her urgent legal consultations and her determination to confront her niece directly on Easter Eve, explaining Claudia's unexpected presence in St. Mary Mead despite her claims of minimal family contact. Miss Ada Pierce, interviewed again in the chilly drawing room of the Pines, maintained her stoic composure with the precision of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her black dress was immaculate, her grief properly regulated, but Miss Marple noted the small burn mark on her thumb, suggesting recent handling of candle stubs, and the faint trace of expensive perfume clinging to her cuffs rather than her customary lavender water. When Miss Marple casually mentioned the silver-framed photograph revealing Miss Pierce's wartime service in a hospital dispensary, the companion's knowledge of sedatives and proper dosages became suddenly significant. Her claim to have remained in the back pew throughout the service contradicted multiple witness accounts, while her detailed familiarity with Mrs. Elmsworth's financial affairs suggested access, extending well beyond her official duties. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the mysterious vial found beneath the vestry cabinet confirmed the presence of a sophisticated sedative that would have rendered Mrs. Elmsworth confused and vulnerable within minutes of consumption, while maintaining the appearance of normal consciousness to casual observers. The compound's availability only through medical prescription, combined with the precise dosage required to avoid detection, pointed to someone with considerable pharmaceutical knowledge. The communion wine, which Mrs. Elmsworth customarily sipped before each service as part of her private devotions, had provided the perfect delivery method for someone familiar with church routines. Father Benedict's burden of knowledge became clearer during Miss Marple's gentle questioning in the churchyard, where spring ivy seemed to creep closer to ancient stones with each passing day. The young priest, his clerical collar askew and his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights, finally admitted that Mrs. Elmsworth had approached him before the service to arrange a private meeting afterward. She had seemed deeply agitated, he confided, troubled by something concerning the purity of her own family name that she felt compelled to disclose. The sacred seal of confession prevented him from revealing more, but his obvious distress suggested that someone had sought absolution for intentions rather than past actions, confessing plans that violated the natural order of family relationships. The village gossip network, efficiently coordinated through Mrs. Bantry's tea gatherings, provided additional fragments that completed Miss Marple's emerging picture. Mrs. Price Ridley had noticed a London motor car parked discreetly near the vicarage lane on Saturday evening, departing without lights in a manner she considered thoroughly improper. Miss Weatherby remembered candle wax on expensive gloves during the post-service handshaking, while Mrs. Dane reported hearing the faint chime of a small bottle in a fashionable handbag. Dr. Haydock's professional opinion that the sedative dosage indicated familiarity rather than guesswork eliminated amateur poisoners and hysterical suspects alike. Old Mr. Henderson, dismissed by most as merely a stubborn farmer attached to his field, provided the final crucial detail when he recalled seeing Mrs. Elmsworth 3 days before, her death crossing the village green with a sealed envelope marked for the priest. She had been in excellent temper, which for Mrs. Elmsworth meant she had discovered leverage and intended to use it. Her declaration that she would set things to rights proper by Easter suggested someone who had finally decided to act on long-suppressed knowledge, regardless of family consequences. The theatrical placement of Mrs. Elmsworth's ivory letter opener now revealed its true purpose as deliberate misdirection intended to focus investigation on obvious suspects while protecting the real killer. The weapon's religious carvings and personal significance were calculated to suggest crimes of passion rather than premeditated murder, motivated by financial desperation and family scandal. Someone had carefully orchestrated the entire scene, counting on Inspector Slack's straightforward approach to pursue obvious clues, while subtler evidence remained overlooked. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple found herself in possession of a complete picture of Easter Eve's tragic events. The real killer remained hidden behind facades of respectability and family loyalty, but their carefully constructed deception was crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence that only the most observant eye could properly interpret. The morning brought Inspector Slack's grudging acknowledgement that his methodical approach had perhaps been too narrow in scope. His confidence in Timothy, Fletcher's guilt eroding under the weight of Miss Marple's quietly accumulated evidence, the violet ink fragment, the expensive gold button with its telltale impressions, and young Tom Redding's testimony about the perfumed London lady had forced him to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the obvious suspect was merely a convenient distraction from more complex truths. His telephone call to Much Benham requesting additional time before filing charges carried the reluctant tone of a man whose professional pride had collided with inconvenient facts. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the Blue Boar revealed Claudia Elmsworth in her carefully maintained pose of fashionable grief, though the young woman's composure showed distinct signs of strain. Her dove-grey silk dress, though elegant, bore the subtle wrinkles of someone who had slept poorly, while her expensive perfume seemed applied with unusual heaviness, as though to mask other scents that might cling to fabric and memory. When Miss Marple casually mentioned the discovery of the cream-colored note, Claudia's reaction was swift but telling, her fingers immediately straying to the missing button on her jacket cuff before she caught herself, and forced a laugh about losing it in the crush of departing parishioners. More significantly, Claudia's explanation of her aunt's request for a private meeting revealed knowledge she should not have possessed. Her reference to Mrs. Elmsworth's nervous condition and need for calming remedies suggested familiarity with the sedative compound that Dr. Whodunit had identified, while her detailed knowledge of church routines and her aunt's devotional habits indicated preparation that extended well beyond casual family visits. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Claudia's hands when she reached for her teacup, and the way her eyes darted toward the window whenever footsteps approached on the cobblestones outside. The arrival of Mr. Goodall, Mrs. Elmsworth's London solicitor, brought revelations that transformed speculation into documented fact. His leather briefcase contained correspondence that painted a damning picture of systematic embezzlement extending back nearly 3 years, with forged signatures on financial documents and unauthorized transfers that had gradually stripped away substantial portions of Mrs. Elmsworth's estate. The elderly woman's growing suspicions, documented in increasingly urgent letters to her legal advisor, revealed a methodical investigation that had finally uncovered the full scope of her niece's criminal activities. Miss Ada Pierce, when confronted with this evidence during her second formal interview, maintained her stoic composure with the precision of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her black dress was immaculate, her grief properly regulated, but Miss Marple observed the small burn mark on her thumb that suggested recent handling of candle wax, and the faint trace of expensive perfume clinging to her cuffs rather than her customary lavender water. When Inspector Slack produced the silver-framed photograph revealing her wartime service in a hospital dispensary, Miss Pierce's acknowledgement was matter-of-fact, though her explanation of why such medical knowledge might be relevant struck Miss Marple as suspiciously rehearsed. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the mysterious vial provided crucial confirmation of the conspiracy's sophisticated nature. The sedative compound required precise preparation and dosage calculation to achieve its intended effect without causing immediate collapse or obvious symptoms. Someone with considerable pharmaceutical knowledge had prepared a solution that would render Mrs. Elmsworth confused and vulnerable within minutes while maintaining the appearance of normal consciousness to casual observers. The communion wine, which Mrs. Elmsworth customarily sipped before each service as part of her private devotions, had provided the perfect delivery method for someone intimately familiar with church routines and personal habits. Father Benedict's continued distress took on new significance when viewed through the lens of documented evidence rather than mere speculation. His admission that Mrs. Elmsworth had seemed deeply agitated before the service, troubled by what she termed betrayal within her own blood, now aligned perfectly with the solicitor's correspondence. The young priest's obvious burden of knowledge, combined with his religious obligation to maintain confidential silence, explained his inability to provide direct assistance, while his behavior clearly indicated awareness of impending tragedy. The psychological pressure was beginning to tell on both primary suspects, though in markedly different ways. Claudia's fashionable composure was cracking under scrutiny, her nervous habits and defensive explanations revealing someone accustomed to deception but unprepared for sustained investigation. Miss Pierce, by contrast, maintained her rigid self-control with almost unnatural precision, her responses calculated and measured in ways that suggested extensive preparation for exactly such questioning. Miss Marple's careful observation of the two women during their brief encounter in the village revealed the subtle dynamics of a conspiracy under strain. Claudia's quick glance toward Miss Pierce carried both accusation and appeal, while the companion's barely perceptible shake of her head suggested warnings about maintaining agreed-upon stories. Their interaction, though lasting mere seconds, confirmed Miss Marple's growing conviction that Mrs. Elmsworth's murder had been carefully planned by two people whose relationship extended well beyond the professional arrangements they publicly maintained. The financial motive had crystallized into clear focus through Mr. Goodall's documentation, revealing not merely inheritance disputes, but systematic theft that would have resulted in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. Mrs. Elmsworth's determination to confront her niece directly on Easter Eve, combined with her intention to demand full restitution regardless of family scandal, had created a situation where murder became the only means of avoiding complete ruin. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green and Inspector Slack prepared for what he clearly hoped would be decisive interviews the following day, Miss Marple found herself in possession of nearly complete understanding of the evening's tragic events. The final pieces of the puzzle remained to be confirmed, but the pattern was unmistakable, waiting only for the right moment and the proper psychological pressure to force the truth into the open where justice could finally prevail. Miss Marple's Thursday afternoon strategy unfolded with the quiet precision of a chess master, arranging pieces for checkmate, though her opponents remained unaware that the game had entered its final phase. She had requested Inspector Slack's permission to conduct what she termed a small social gathering at the Blue Boar, ostensibly to discuss Mrs. Elmsworth's memorial arrangements with her surviving family and companion. The inspector, increasingly convinced that Miss Marple's observations held merit, agreed to observe discreetly from the adjoining parlor while she orchestrated what she privately considered her final test of human nature. The drawing-room's afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the worn Persian carpet as Claudia Elmsworth and Miss Ada Pierce seated themselves with the careful distance of people maintaining necessary pretenses. Miss Marple settled into her chair with her customary knitting, her pale blue eyes noting immediately the subtle signs of strain that both women displayed despite their composed facades. Claudia's expensive traveling suit showed the telltale wrinkles of sleepless nights, while Miss Pierce's rigid posture suggested someone prepared for battle rather than bereaved companionship. Dr. Haydock's arrival with additional evidence provided the perfect opening for Miss Marple's psychological gambit. The good doctor, briefed on her intentions, announced that his final analysis had revealed fascinating details about the crime scene that might interest those who knew Mrs. Elmsworth well. The sedative compound, he explained with clinical precision, required sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge to prepare correctly, while the delivery method suggested intimate familiarity with the victim's personal habits and devotional routine. Miss Marple began her gentle interrogation by reminiscing about Mrs. Elmsworth's meticulous nature, particularly regarding financial matters and her recent correspondence with London solicitors. She spoke warmly of the elderly woman's determination to set things to rights regardless of personal cost, watching carefully as both women's expressions shifted almost imperceptibly. Claudia's fingers unconsciously traced the outline of her missing jacket button, while Miss Pierce's jaw tightened with barely controlled tension. The conversation turned to Mrs. Elmsworth's devotional habits, her customary sip of communion wine before each service, and her beloved prayer book with its distinctive floral cover. Miss Marple mentioned casually the interesting indentations she had noticed in the prayer book's pages, marks that suggested someone had pressed a decorative button into the paper during moments of nervous tension. When she produced the small gold button found beneath the front pew, Claudia's composure flickered visibly, her eyes darting toward Miss Pierce in a moment of shared panic. Dr. Haydock contributed his observations about the precision required for the fatal wound, noting that the angle and depth suggested either medical training or extraordinary anatomical knowledge. Miss Pierce's wartime service in a hospital dispensary, he observed neutrally, would certainly have provided such expertise, while the pharmaceutical calculations found among Mrs. Elmsworth's papers indicated someone familiar with dosage requirements for various medications. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple mentioned Father Benedict's obvious distress and his admission that Mrs. Elmsworth had arranged a private meeting after the service to discuss betrayal within her own blood. She spoke gently of the young priest's burden of knowledge, his religious obligation to maintain confidential silence, and his clear awareness that tragedy had been prevented only by its swift completion. Claudia's carefully maintained facade began cracking under the accumulated weight of evidence and implication. Her breathing became shallow, her expensive perfume unable to mask the scent of perspiration, while her nervous gestures grew increasingly obvious. Miss Pierce, by contrast, maintained her stoic composure with almost unnatural precision, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes avoided direct contact with her accomplice. The breakthrough moment arrived when Miss Marple produced the cream-colored paper fragment bearing violet ink, explaining how such distinctive stationery had been found in Mrs. Elmsworth's prayer book along with what appeared to be the beginning of a signature. The handwriting analysis, she mentioned conversationally, had revealed interesting characteristics about pen pressure and letter formation that suggested someone accustomed to signing important documents, possibly financial ones. Dr. Haydock's final contribution concerned the expensive perfume traces found on Mrs. Elmsworth's clothing, scents that indicated intimate contact during her final moments. The combination of orris and powder, he noted, was quite distinctive and certainly not something the victim would have worn given her preference for simple lavender water. Miss Marple observed both women's reactions carefully, noting how Claudia unconsciously touched her throat, while Miss Pierce's rigid control seemed to require increasing effort. The afternoon's careful orchestration reached its climax when Inspector Slack emerged from the adjoining parlour with additional evidence that had arrived from London. Mr. Goodall's documentation revealed not merely inheritance disputes, but systematic embezzlement extending back several years, with forged signatures on financial documents that would result in criminal prosecution, regardless of family considerations. Mrs. Elmsworth's determination to pursue justice, combined with her intention to demand full restitution, had created circumstances where murder became the only means of avoiding complete ruin. As the weight of accumulated evidence pressed down upon them, both women's carefully constructed partnership showed signs of fatal strain. Claudia's glances toward Miss Pierce carried both accusation and desperate appeal, while the companion's barely perceptible warnings about maintaining agreed-upon stories revealed the conspiracy's fragile foundation. Miss Marple recognized the moment when psychological pressure had achieved its intended effect, though she knew the final revelations would require one more carefully orchestrated confrontation to force complete truth into the open, where justice could finally prevail. The drawing room at the Blue Boar had fallen into an expectant hush as Miss Marple carefully arranged her knitting in her lap, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully between Claudia Elmsworth and Miss Ada Pierce. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the worn Persian carpet, illuminating two women whose carefully maintained composure was beginning to show hairline cracks under the accumulated weight of evidence and gentle pressure. Inspector Slack observed from the doorway, his notebook ready, while Dr. Haydock settled into his chair with the satisfied air of a man whose medical expertise had finally found its proper application. Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, speaking of Mrs. Elmsworth's meticulous nature and her recent correspondence with London solicitors. She mentioned the elderly woman's determination to set things to rights, regardless of personal cost, watching carefully as both women's expressions shifted almost imperceptibly. Claudia's fingers unconsciously traced the outline of her missing jacket button, while Miss Pierce's jaw tightened with barely controlled tension that spoke of long-suppressed emotions finally approaching their breaking point. The cream-colored paper fragment, with its distinctive violet ink and torn signature, lay on the tea table like an accusation waiting to be acknowledged. Miss Marple explained how Mrs. Elmsworth had discovered the systematic embezzlement, the forged signatures on financial documents, and the unauthorized transfers that had gradually stripped away substantial portions of her estate over several years. The elderly woman's growing suspicions, documented in increasingly urgent letters to Mr. Goodall, revealed a methodical investigation that had finally uncovered the full scope of her niece's criminal activities. Dr. Haydock contributed his analysis of the sedative compound, explaining how its sophisticated preparation required precise pharmaceutical knowledge to achieve the intended effect without causing immediate collapse. Someone with considerable medical expertise had calculated a dosage that would render Mrs. Elmsworth confused and vulnerable within minutes, while maintaining the appearance of normal consciousness to casual observers. Miss Pierce's wartime service in a hospital dispensary, Miss Marple noted gently, would certainly have provided such specialized knowledge. The communion wine, which Mrs. Elmsworth customarily sipped before each service as part of her private devotions, had provided the perfect delivery method for someone intimately familiar with church routines and personal habits. Young Tom Redding's testimony about the perfumed London lady near the communion vessels took on new significance when combined with the expensive scent traces found on the victim's clothing, scents that indicated intimate contact during Mrs. Elmsworth's final moments. Miss Marple produced the small gold button found beneath the front pew, explaining how its distinctive scroll work had left telltale indentations in Mrs. Elmsworth's prayer book. Someone had sat beside the victim during the service, nervously pressing this expensive button into the paper while engaging in whispered conversation. The button's obvious quality and fashionable design eliminated village suspects, while pointing towards someone accustomed to London attire and sophisticated accessories. The psychological pressure began to tell as Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the conspiracy's careful orchestration. Mrs. Elmsworth's intention to confront her niece directly on Easter Eve, combined with her determination to pursue criminal prosecution regardless of family scandal, had created circumstances where murder became the only means of avoiding complete ruin. The choice of Easter Eve for the crime suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action, someone who understood both the psychological impact and the practical advantages of hiding in plain sight among the faithful. Claudia's carefully maintained facade began cracking under the accumulated evidence. Her breathing became shallow, her expensive perfume unable to mask the scent of perspiration, while her nervous gestures grew increasingly obvious. When Miss Marple mentioned the precision required for the fatal wound, noting that the angle and depth suggested either medical training or extraordinary anatomical knowledge, Miss Pierce's stoic composure showed its first signs of strain. The breakthrough moment arrived when the psychological pressure finally exceeded both women's capacity for deception. Claudia's composure shattered completely as she turned toward Miss Pierce with eyes blazing with accusation and desperation. Her voice rose to a pitch that carried clearly through the ancient inn's walls as she declared that she had never intended for anyone to die. That the plan had been merely to render her aunt unconscious long enough to retrieve incriminating documents, and that Miss Pierce had exceeded their agreement by using the letter opener with deadly precision. Miss Pierce's stoic mask slipped for the first time since the investigation began, revealing beneath her composed exterior a woman capable of calculating ruthlessness. Her admission came in measured tones that carried no trace of remorse, explaining with clinical detachment how Mrs. Elmsworth's discovery of the embezzlement had left them no alternative but permanent silence. She described the elderly woman's threats to pursue justice regardless of consequences, her determination to recover every stolen pound, and her intention to see both conspirators imprisoned despite decades of service and blood relationship. As Inspector Slack prepared the formal charges that would end both women's freedom, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Easter Eve murder committed in God's house by those who had enjoyed the victim's trust for decades. The conspiracy's sophisticated planning and ruthless execution revealed depths of human calculation that challenged even her extensive understanding of criminal psychology, while the partnership's breakdown under pressure demonstrated how evil ultimately consumed those who embraced it completely. The drawing room at the Blue Boar had fallen into expectant silence as Miss Marple carefully set aside her knitting, her pale blue eyes moving with quiet authority between Claudia Elmsworth and Miss Ada Pierce. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the worn Persian carpet, illuminating two women whose carefully maintained composure was finally crumbling under the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure. Inspector Slack observed from the doorway with his notebook ready, while Dr. Haydock settled into his chair with the satisfied air of a man whose medical expertise had found its proper application in the service of justice. Miss Marple began her final explanation with characteristic gentleness, speaking of how Mrs. Elmsworth had discovered the systematic embezzlement through her meticulous review of financial records. The elderly woman's correspondence with Mr. Goodall revealed not mere inheritance disputes, but documented theft extending back several years, with forged signatures on financial documents that would have resulted in criminal prosecution regardless of family considerations. Mrs. Elmsworth's determination to pursue justice, combined with her intention to confront her niece directly on Easter Eve, had created circumstances where murder seemed the only escape from complete ruin. The conspiracy had required careful coordination over several months, Miss Marple explained, with Miss Pierce providing pharmaceutical expertise gained during wartime. Hospital service, while Claudia supplied the financial desperation and access to her aunt's correspondence. The sedative compound, precisely calculated to avoid immediate collapse while ensuring disorientation, had been delivered through Mrs. Elmsworth's customary sip of communion wine before the service. Young Tom Redding's testimony about the perfumed London lady near the communion vessels, combined with expensive scent traces found on the victim's clothing, confirmed Claudia's presence and intimate contact during the crucial moments. Dr. Haydock's analysis revealed the sophisticated nature of their preparation, noting that the dosage calculations demonstrated considerable medical knowledge, while the delivery method showed intimate familiarity with Mrs. Elmsworth's devotional routines. The ivory letter opener, carved with religious motifs and bearing the victim's initials, had been selected not merely as a weapon of convenience, but as part of their misdirection strategy, designed to focus investigation on obvious suspects while obscuring the true conspiracy. The psychological pressure finally exceeded both women's capacity for sustained deception. Claudia's fashionable composure shattered completely as she turned toward Miss Pierce with desperate accusation, her voice rising as she insisted that the plan had been merely to render her aunt unconscious long enough to retrieve incriminating documents. Miss Pierce had exceeded their agreement, she declared with increasing hysteria, by using the letter opener with deadly precision when Mrs. Elmsworth showed unexpected resistance despite the sedative's effects. Miss Pierce's stoic mask slipped for the first time since the investigation began, revealing beneath her composed exterior a woman capable of calculating ruthlessness. Her admission came in measured tones that carried no trace of remorse, explaining with clinical detachment how Mrs. Elmsworth's discovery of the embezzlement had left them no alternative but permanent silence. The elderly woman's threats to pursue justice regardless of consequences, her determination to recover every stolen pound, and her intention to see both conspirators imprisoned had made murder seem their only viable option. Inspector Slack moved swiftly to formalize the charges as the conspiracy's partnership dissolved under the weight of mutual accusations. Murder for Miss Pierce, conspiracy and accessory for Claudia, while the Crown would determine additional charges related to the systematic embezzlement. The handcuffs clicked shut with finality that echoed through the Blue Boar's ancient walls, marking the end of a deception that had culminated in sacred ground being desecrated by those who had enjoyed their victims' trust for years. The village reaction was complex, mixing shock at such calculated evil existing within their peaceful community with relief that justice had finally prevailed. Father Benedict, released from the terrible burden of sealed knowledge, found measure of peace, though the shadow of Easter Eve would forever mark his ministry. Timothy Fletcher, wrongly suspected and formally cleared, chose to remain in St. Mary Mead despite his ordeal, dedicating his musical talents to healing the wounds that violent crime had inflicted upon the community. Mrs. Bantry confessed to feeling utterly foolish for having been misled by Claudia's superficial charm, while other villagers frantically re-evaluated past interactions, suddenly remembering small details that now pointed directly toward the truth. The daffodils continued blooming in the churchyard. The ancient stones of St. John the Baptist stood unchanged, but beneath the surface lay heightened awareness of the complexities that could lurk behind familiar faces and polite routines. Miss Marple, returning to her cottage as evening shadows lengthened across the village green, reflected on the tragic irony of Easter Eve murder committed in God's house by those who had perverted trust into opportunity for evil. The conspiracy's sophisticated planning and ruthless execution challenged even her extensive understanding of human nature, while the partnership's breakdown demonstrated how wickedness ultimately consumed those who embraced it without reservation. Both women had possessed alternatives to murder, she noted sadly, but had chosen the path that seemed to offer complete solution rather than accepting partial justice and public shame. As St. Mary Mead slowly resumed its peaceful rhythms, Miss Marple understood that, while this immediate crisis had passed, the eternal mystery of human capacity for both good and evil would continue unfolding in countless quiet corners of the world, requiring constant vigilance to protect the fragile bonds that held communities together. The weeks following the arrests brought a peculiar atmosphere to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself was slowly exhaling after holding its breath through the investigation's tense progression. Miss Marple observed this gradual return to normalcy from her cottage garden, where the late spring flowers seemed to bloom with unusual vigor, as if nature itself sought to restore beauty after witnessing such calculated ugliness. The ancient rhythms of village life reasserted themselves with determined persistence, though conversations carried undertones that had not existed before Easter Eve's tragic revelations. Inspector Slack departed for Much Benham with mixed feelings about the case's resolution, his professional satisfaction at solving the crime tempered by uncomfortable awareness that his methodical approach had nearly resulted in charging an innocent man. Timothy Fletcher's near arrest served as a sobering reminder that obvious suspects were not always guilty ones, while Miss Marple's patient observation had revealed truths that conventional investigation might have missed entirely. The inspector's final report praised her assistance while privately acknowledging that village mysteries required understanding of human nature, extending well beyond standard police procedures. Father Benedict found himself wrestling with complex emotions as he prepared to resume normal services in St. John the Baptist. The young priest's burden of sealed knowledge had been lifted by the conspirators' confessions, though the shadow of Easter Eve would forever mark his ministry in subtle ways. His revelation that Mrs. Elmsworth had entrusted him with a sealed envelope containing evidence of the embezzlement, to be opened only if she could not speak for herself, finally explained his terrible distress. The envelope had contained not merely financial documentation, but her intention to offer Claudia private confrontation and possible reconciliation before pursuing legal action, demonstrating even in death the complex mixture of justice and mercy that had characterized her difficult personality. Timothy Fletcher's decision to remain in St. Mary Mead despite his ordeal impressed the community with quiet courage that spoke well of his character. His proposal for a memorial concert honoring Mrs. Elmsworth, while perhaps ironic given their musical disagreements, served as a gesture of forgiveness that helped heal the village's wounded spirit. The young choir master's ability to transform his near persecution into an opportunity for grace provided a powerful example of Christian charity that inspired renewed appreciation for both his artistic contributions and his moral strength. Village gossip networks, efficiently coordinated through Mrs. Bantry's tea gatherings, gradually processed the shocking revelations while seeking to understand how such calculated evil had remained hidden among familiar faces. Mrs. Price Ridley found vindication in her earlier observations about the mysteriously parked London motor car, while Miss Weatherby recalled with startling clarity the candle wax on expensive gloves that had seemed merely odd at the time. The conspiracy's sophistication troubled residents who had prided themselves on knowing their neighbors thoroughly, forcing uncomfortable recognition that surface respectability could mask depths of deception. Dr. Haydock reflected on the case's medical aspects, particularly the pharmaceutical knowledge that Miss Pierce had employed in preparing the sedative compound. Her wartime hospital service, initially viewed as admirable public service, now appeared in darker light as training that had enabled calculated murder. The precision required for both the poisoning and the fatal wound suggested someone who understood human anatomy with clinical detachment, transforming healing knowledge into instruments of destruction. The financial implications extended far beyond immediate criminal charges, as Mr. Goodall worked tirelessly to untangle years of systematic embezzlement. Mrs. Elmsworth's estate, substantially diminished by her niece's theft, required careful administration to honor her charitable intentions. The Idor revelation that she had planned to purchase Henderson's field for church expansion, along with substantial bequests to the roof fund, provided practical solutions to long-standing parish disputes while demonstrating that her formidable nature had been directed toward genuinely constructive purposes. The Blue Boar, scene of Miss Marple's final psychological confrontation, became something of a curiosity for visitors, though landlord Griggs maintained respectful discretion about the details. The drawing room where the conspiracy had finally unraveled was quietly redecorated, removing physical reminders while preserving the inn's historical character. Local residents appreciated this tactful approach, understanding that some memories require gentle handling rather than sensational exploitation. Miss Marple herself resumed her customary routines with characteristic composure, though those who knew her well detected subtle changes in her approach to village observation. Her pale blue eyes seemed to probe more deeply beneath surface appearances, while her conversations carried gentle warnings about the dangers of assuming that familiar faces necessarily indicated trustworthy hearts. She reflected often on how easily people persuaded themselves that concealment was kindness, and how such deceptions accumulated pressure until they burst forth with devastating consequences. The church gradually reclaimed its atmosphere of peaceful sanctuary as regular services resumed and physical reminders of violence were carefully removed. Mrs. Elmsworth's memorial plaque was installed with appropriate ceremony, though her customary front pew remained temporarily unoccupied by mutual agreement. The communion wine service required special blessing before Father Benedict felt comfortable resuming its traditional role in worship, understanding that sacred rituals needed conscious restoration after being violated by calculated evil. As summer approached and immediate shock began to fade, St. Mary Mead found itself changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The daffodils had given way to roses, the ancient stones stood unchanged, but beneath the surface lay deeper understanding of the eternal struggle between good and evil that required constant vigilance to maintain civilization's fragile bonds. The June sunlight lay warm upon the thatched roofs and ancient stone walls of St. Mary Mead, as though summer itself had resolved to press gentle healing over the village's wounded places. From Miss Marple's cottage garden came the soft click of knitting needles and the drowsy hum of bees negotiating with roses that had replaced the Easter daffodils. 3 months had passed since that terrible evening when Mrs. Elmsworth met her end in the sanctuary of St. John the Baptist, and the village had gradually settled back into its familiar rhythms, though with an undercurrent of hard-won wisdom about the complexities that could lurk beneath the most respectable facades. The trial had concluded the previous week with verdicts that surprised no one who had followed Miss Marple's careful unraveling of the conspiracy. Miss Ada Pierce received life imprisonment for murder, her stoic composure maintained even as the judge pronounced sentence with grave finality. Her wartime medical service, once viewed as admirable dedication, had provided the pharmaceutical knowledge that enabled calculated murder, transforming healing skills into instruments of destruction. Claudia Elmsworth's tears and protestations of never intending death earned her 20 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder, though her obvious remorse provided little comfort to those who remembered Mrs. Elmsworth's formidable but ultimately charitable nature. The systematic embezzlement charges added additional years to both sentences, ensuring that neither woman would trouble St. Mary Mead again for decades to come. Father Benedict had found his peace through the gradual healing that time and prayer could provide, his sermons carrying new depth born from confronting evil directly and witnessing justice prevail through patient observation rather than hasty judgment. The young priest often reflected on Mrs. Elmsworth's final letter, which had revealed her intention to offer private confrontation and possible reconciliation before pursuing legal action, demonstrating even in death the complex mixture of justice and mercy that had characterized her difficult personality. His burden of sealed knowledge had been lifted by the conspirators' confessions, though the shadow of Easter Eve would forever mark his ministry with deeper understanding of human frailty and divine grace. Timothy Fletcher's decision to remain in St. Mary Mead despite his ordeal had impressed residents with quiet courage that spoke well of his character. His memorial concert, carefully planned to honor Mrs. Elmsworth's traditional preferences while incorporating subtle modern elements, had achieved remarkable success in transforming his near persecution into an opportunity for community healing. The young choir master's ability to find forgiveness rather than bitterness provided a powerful example of Christian charity that helped the village process its collective trauma through the universal language of music. Dr. Haydock continued his practice with renewed appreciation for the responsibility that medical knowledge carried, understanding how easily healing skills could be perverted into instruments of destruction. His role in uncovering the pharmaceutical aspects of the conspiracy had demonstrated the importance of scientific analysis in criminal investigation, while his collaboration with Miss Marple had deepened their friendship through shared pursuit of justice. The good doctor often reflected on how professional expertise, divorced from moral foundation, could become a tool for evil rather than healing. The financial aftermath had required months of careful administration as Mr. Goodall worked to untangle years of systematic theft and restore Mrs. Elmsworth's charitable intentions. Her estate, though substantially diminished by embezzlement, still provided sufficient funds for the church roof repairs and the purchase of Henderson's Field for parish expansion. These practical benefits helped the community remember Mrs. Elmsworth's constructive purposes, rather than dwelling exclusively on the circumstances of her death, transforming tragedy into lasting improvements that would benefit future generations. Village life had resumed its ancient patterns with the resilience that small communities developed through centuries of weathering various crises, though conversations carried subtle acknowledgments of lessons learned through harsh experience. Mrs. Bantry's tea gatherings continued to serve as information exchanges, but with heightened awareness that surface appearances could mask dangerous deceptions. The knowledge that such calculated evil had festered unseen among them, nurtured by long-standing resentment and financial desperation, had irrevocably altered the fabric of trust that bound the community together. Inspector Slack's subsequent cases benefited from his St. Mary Mead experience. His methodical approach now supplemented by greater attention to psychological observation and patient accumulation of seemingly minor evidence. The inspector's professional respect for Miss Marple had grown considerably through their collaboration, leading to informal consultations on other complex investigations where understanding human nature proved more valuable than conventional police procedures. His final report on the Elmsworth case became required reading at the police college, demonstrating how village mysteries required specialized approaches that honored both scientific method and intuitive wisdom. Miss Marple herself had emerged from the experience with her faith in human nature intact, though tempered by deeper understanding of the lengths to which desperate people might go when cornered by their own deceptions. Her gentle observations continued to illuminate the hidden currents of village life, while her conversations carried subtle warnings about the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even under extreme pressure. She understood that evil rarely announced itself dramatically, but instead crept forward through small compromises and justified deceptions until ordinary people found themselves capable of extraordinary wickedness. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green and the church bells called the faithful to vespers, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal mystery of human choice between good and evil that required constant vigilance to protect civilization's fragile bonds. The roses in her garden nodded gently in the summer breeze, their beauty unmarred by the knowledge of what darkness could flourish in the most peaceful settings. St. Mary Mead would continue to provide all the necessary analogies for human nature's complexities, and Miss Marple, with her ball of wool like a pale moon in her basket, would continue to observe with patient interest, understanding that truth, however long delayed, eventually found its way to the surface where justice could finally prevail.